The morning Margaret Sinclair disappeared from the Beaumont plantation, nobody noticed for nearly 3 hours. That was unusual, because Margaret was perhaps the most watched woman in all of Beaufort County, South Carolina, watched by the enslaved people who lived in fear of what her beauty brought down upon all of them, and watched by the white family who owned her, each for their own twisted reasons. It was October 1850, and Margaret was 22 years old. She'd been born on the Beaumont plantation to a woman named Catherine who died in childbirth. Margaret had been raised by the other enslaved women in the quarters, growing from a beautiful child into a stunning young woman whose appearance became both her greatest curse and, eventually, her only weapon. Her skin was the color of honey, her features delicate and striking, her hair a mass of dark curls that she kept carefully wrapped. She was tall and graceful, moving through the world with a quiet dignity that no amount of cruelty could strip away. And from the time she was 14 years old, she'd been the obsession of Edward Beaumont, the plantation owner's eldest son. Edward was 35 now, married to a cold woman named Virginia who'd given him 3 children and no affection. He'd decided years ago that Margaret belonged to him, and in the world of slavery where enslaved people had no rights to their own bodies, no one could stop him from taking what he wanted. Margaret had been forced to become Edward's mistress when she was 16. For 6 years, she'd endured his visits to her cabin, his possessive cruelty, his belief that owning her body meant owning her soul. She'd had 3 pregnancies in those 6 years, one ended in miscarriage, one in stillbirth, and one produced a daughter who'd been born light-skinned and immediately sold away to hide the evidence of Edward's crime. The loss of her daughter had broken something in Margaret. For 2 years after that sale, she'd moved through life like a ghost, hollow and silent. The other enslaved people worried she might take her own life. But slowly, quietly, Margaret had begun to come back to herself, not the girl she'd been before, but someone harder, someone who'd learned to survive by appearing broken while secretly planning. On the morning of her disappearance, Margaret had been working in the big house as she did every day, cleaning, serving meals, being invisible while gathering information. She'd learned over the years that white people spoke freely in front of enslaved people, as if they were furniture without ears or understanding. She'd heard Edward arguing with his father about debts. She'd heard Virginia complaining to her friends about the shame of having her husband's preferences be so obvious that everyone knew he kept a slave mistress. She'd heard the overseer discussing which enslaved people were planning to run and which could be trusted. And she'd heard something else, a conversation between Edward and a slave trader who'd come to assess the plantation's stock for possible sale. "What about that girl, the pretty one?" the trader had asked. "She'd fetch a good price in New Orleans. Light-skinned, young, healthy, she could work in a fancy house or a gentleman's club. Might bring $1,500 or more." Margaret had frozen while polishing silver in the dining room, her heart pounding. "She's not for sale," Edward had said sharply. "Margaret stays here. Shame. Could help with your debt situation. But I suppose a man's entitled to keep his favorites." After the trader left, Margaret had returned to her cabin in the quarters. It was a small structure, maybe 12 by 12 feet, with a dirt floor and rough wooden walls. She shared it with 2 other enslaved women, Ruth and Patience, who were already asleep when Margaret arrived. But Margaret didn't sleep. She lit a small candle and pulled up the loose floorboard in the corner of the cabin, a hiding place she'd discovered years ago and carefully maintained. Beneath the floorboard was a space maybe 2 feet deep, hidden from casual view. And in that space, Margaret had been building her escape for 2 years. There were clothes, men's clothes she'd stolen piece by piece from the plantation laundry, along with a worn jacket and a hat that would help her disguise herself as a man during her escape. There was food, dried meat, hardtack, a few precious vegetables she'd been setting aside for months. There were matches wrapped in oilcloth to keep them dry. And most importantly, there was a knife, not large, but sharp, taken from the kitchen and hidden away for the day when she'd need to defend herself. There was also a map, carefully drawn on a piece of cloth, showing the routes north through South Carolina and into North Carolina. Margaret had memorized every detail, every turn, every landmark that would guide her toward freedom. She'd gotten the information by listening, always listening. She'd heard enslaved people whispering about the Underground Railroad. She'd heard white people discussing which areas were more sympathetic to fugitives and which were patrolled heavily by slave catchers. She'd pieced together a route from dozens of conversations over 2 years. And she'd learned something else, something that had finally given her the courage to run. There was a woman in Charleston, a freed black woman named Delilah, who helped fugitive enslaved people escape by sea. Ships left Charleston regularly for northern ports, and for the right price, or the right persuasion, a captain might be convinced to carry secret cargo. Margaret had been saving for years, taking tiny amounts of money whenever she could, pennies stolen from coat pockets, nickels taken from coin purses left carelessly around the big house. It was theft that could get her killed, but she'd been desperate and careful. Over 2 years, she'd accumulated $8.37. Not much, but maybe enough to bribe her way onto a ship, or to buy food and shelter until she could find other help. That night, listening to Ruth and Patience breathing in sleep, Margaret made her final decision. Edward was planning to take his family to Charleston for 2 weeks, some business and social obligations. He'd told Margaret she'd be coming with them to attend to household needs, which really meant he wanted access to her away from the plantation and his wife's increasingly suspicious questions. If Margaret went to Charleston as Edward's captive mistress, she'd be trapped in a city she didn't know, under his constant watch. But if she ran before the trip, ran now, tonight, she had a chance. A small chance, dangerous and terrifying, but a chance nonetheless. She'd lived as property for 22 years. She'd endured rape and forced pregnancy and the theft of her child. She'd survived by appearing docile while secretly gathering strength. And now, finally, she was ready to fight for her freedom or die trying. Margaret carefully repacked her hidden supplies, then lay down beside Ruth and Patience, waiting for the darkest part of the night. At 3 a.m, when even the overseer's dogs were sleeping, Margaret rose silently. She dressed in layers, her regular dress on the outside to avoid suspicion if anyone saw her, with the men's clothes underneath. She wrapped her hidden supplies in a cloth bundle and tucked it under her arm as if it were laundry. She paused at the door of the cabin, looking back at Ruth and Patience. Should she wake them? Tell them she was leaving? Ask them to cover for her when her absence was discovered? But that would put them in danger. If they knew Margaret had run and didn't immediately report it, they'd be punished, whipped, possibly sold. The safest thing for everyone was for Margaret to leave silently, letting them honestly claim they'd heard nothing and seen nothing. Margaret slipped out into the night, moving carefully between the cabins of the slave quarters. Dogs stirred but didn't bark, they knew her scent, saw her as part of the normal nighttime movements on the plantation. She made it to the edge of the plantation property without incident. Beyond the cotton fields lay forest, thick and dark, that stretched for miles toward the coast. Once she entered those woods, she'd be committed. There'd be no coming back, no second chances. Margaret thought about her daughter, sold away 2 years ago at age 4, too young to remember her mother. She thought about the other children she'd lost to miscarriage and stillbirth, babies who'd never had a chance at life. She thought about Edward's hands on her body, his belief that she existed only for his pleasure, his complete disregard for her humanity. And she thought about freedom. About a life where she controlled her own body, made her own choices, wasn't property to be used and sold at someone else's whim. She stepped into the forest and started running. Behind her, the Beaumont plantation slept, unaware that its most beautiful slave woman had just vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only questions and the secrets hidden in her cabin floor. By morning, when Margaret failed to appear for her duties in the big house, Virginia Beaumont grew irritated. She sent a house slave to fetch Margaret, but the woman returned confused. Margaret wasn't in her cabin, and Ruth and Patience claimed they hadn't seen her leave. Virginia told Edward, who immediately assembled the overseer and several slave patrollers. They searched the plantation, growing increasingly angry when Margaret couldn't be found. Edward's fury was particularly intense. Margaret was his possession, his property, and her absence felt like a personal betrayal. "She's run," the overseer said grimly. "Got a several-hour head start too. She could be anywhere by now. Then find her." Edward roared. "I want every slave catcher in the county looking for her. I want dogs tracking her. I want her found and brought back, and when she is, I'll make an example of her that will ensure no one else ever tries to run from this plantation." The slave catchers went out with dogs, following Margaret's scent from her cabin to the edge of the forest. The dogs picked up her trail easily. She'd had no way to mask her scent, no time to wade through streams or use the tricks more experienced runaways employed. But Margaret had something the slave catchers didn't expect, a 2-year plan executed with careful precision. While Edward and his men searched the forest, assuming Margaret would head north toward the possibility of free states, Margaret was actually heading southeast toward the coast. She deliberately left a trail the dogs could follow for the first few miles, then she'd reached a stream she'd scouted months ago during a rare trip to fetch water. Margaret had waded downstream for nearly a mile, the cold water soaking her clothes but hiding her scent. Then she'd climbed out on the far bank, removed her dress to reveal the men's clothes underneath, and changed her entire appearance. She bound her chest, tucked her hair under the stolen hat, and rubbed dirt on her face to look weathered and masculine. In men's clothing, moving with a different gait, she looked nothing like the beautiful enslaved woman everyone was searching for. She looked like a young black man, possibly a free person of color, possibly an enslaved person on legitimate business for his master. The disguise was her protection. Slave catchers would be looking for a woman, a specific woman, beautiful and distinctive. They'd question women traveling alone, especially light-skinned women who might be trying to pass as free. But a young black man arousing less suspicion, especially if he acted confident and purposeful rather than furtive. Margaret walked through the day, moving steadily toward Charleston. When she encountered other people on the road, she nodded confidently, acting like she belonged there. When a white man asked where she was going, she said she was running an errand for Master Pemberton in Charleston, a common enough name that the man didn't question it. She was terrified every moment, certain someone would see through her disguise or recognize her despite the masculine clothing. But no one did. People saw what they expected to see, a young black man on some master's business, and they let her pass. By nightfall, Margaret had covered nearly 15 miles. Her feet were blistered and bleeding, her body exhausted from hours of walking. But she was free. For the first time in her 22 years, she was making her own choices, going where she wanted to go, not owned by anyone. She found shelter in an abandoned barn and collapsed onto moldy hay, too exhausted to even eat the food she'd brought. She slept fitfully, startling awake at every sound, terrified that slave catchers had tracked her somehow. But morning came, and she was still alone and free. Margaret continued toward Charleston, following the route she'd memorized from her hand-drawn map. It took her 3 days to reach the city, 3 days of walking and hiding and maintaining her masculine disguise. Charleston was overwhelming, more people than Margaret had ever seen, more noise and activity and chaos than the ordered structure of plantation life. Ships filled the harbor, their masts like a forest against the sky. White people and enslaved people and free blacks mixed in the streets, conducting business, hauling cargo, living lives Margaret had only imagined. She needed to find Delilah, the freed woman who supposedly helped fugitives escape by sea. But Margaret had only vague information. Delilah lived somewhere near the docks, ran some kind of business that gave her legitimate reasons to be around the ships. Margaret spent half a day asking careful questions, trying to find Delilah without revealing that she was a runaway. Finally, a free black dock worker gave her useful information. "You looking for Miss Delilah? She runs a laundry service down by the waterfront. Takes in washing from the ships. But she don't talk to just anybody, you got to come with a reference or she'll turn you away." "What kind of reference?" The man looked at Margaret carefully, seeing something in her desperation. "Tell her Jacob sent you. Tell her you're looking for special services. She'll know what you mean." Margaret found the laundry, a small building near the docks with several women working over huge washtubs. She asked for Delilah and was led to a back room where a woman in her 50s sat doing accounts in a ledger. Delilah looked up, her sharp eyes taking in Margaret's masculine disguise immediately. "Who are you and what do you want?" "Jacob sent me. He said you provide special services." Delilah studied Margaret for a long moment, then gestured for the other woman to leave and close the door. "You're running. How long since you left?" "4 days. From Beaufort County. They'll be looking for you. Probably have your description circulated to every slave catcher in South Carolina by now. What makes you think I can help?" "I heard you get people north. On ships. I have money, not much, but something. And I can work, I can." "Take off that hat," Delilah interrupted. Margaret removed the hat, revealing her carefully bound hair. Delilah's expression shifted. "You're that girl. The one from the Beaumont plantation." "Edward Beaumont's," she didn't finish the sentence. "Child, every slave catcher in the state is looking for you. There's a $500 reward on your head." $500. Do you understand what that means? That means every person you pass, every person who sees you, has a reason to turn you in. Margaret felt her hope crumbling. "Please. I can't go back. If they take me back, Edward will," her voice broke. "He'll kill me. Maybe not immediately, but he'll break me. He'll make an example of me. Please, there has to be a way." Delilah looked at this young woman, this beautiful, desperate fugitive who'd been brave enough or desperate enough to run from one of the most powerful families in the region. She thought about the dozens of people she'd helped escape over the years, the risks she'd taken, the close calls with authorities who suspected her activities. This girl was dangerous. Helping her could bring Delilah's entire operation crashing down. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to turn her away. But Delilah had been enslaved herself once. She'd run to freedom 30 years ago and had spent every year since helping others do the same. And she couldn't look at Margaret's desperate face and say no. "I can get you on a ship," Delilah said finally. "But it's going to be dangerous and it's going to cost more than the $8 you're carrying." Margaret's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "I know everything that matters. Now listen carefully. There's a ship leaving for Philadelphia in 3 days, the merchant vessel called the Helena. The captain is sympathetic to our cause, but he's also practical. He'll want payment for the risk of carrying you. The cost is $50. I don't have $50. I only have $8. Then you'll have to earn the rest." Delilah pulled out a piece of paper and wrote something quickly. "Take this to a house on Queen Street. The woman who runs it will give you work." "Not," she held up a hand as Margaret's face showed fear, "not that kind of work. Laundry, cleaning, kitchen work. She pays fair wages. You work hard for 3 days, you'll earn enough to make up the difference." Margaret took the paper with shaking hands. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I was you once. Because somebody helped me when I was running. Because the system that made you property is evil and I'll spend every day I have left fighting against it." Delilah stood. "Now go. Keep that disguise on. Be back here in 3 days with the full $50, and I'll get you on that ship." Margaret left the laundry and found the house on Queen Street. The woman there, a freed black woman named Sarah who ran a boarding house, took one look at Margaret's masculine disguise and knew immediately what was happening. "Delilah sent you. You're running." "Yes, ma'am." "Can you clean? Can you cook?" "Yes, ma'am. I worked in a big house for years." "Then you'll work here. 3 days, dawn to dusk. I'll pay you $15, that's generous, but Delilah vouched for you and I trust her judgment. You keep your head down, you stay out of sight, and you work hard. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you." For 3 days, Margaret worked harder than she'd ever worked, even in slavery. She cleaned rooms, washed linens, helped prepare meals, scrubbed floors until her hands were raw. She avoided going outside, avoided drawing any attention to herself. And she listened. Because Sarah's boarding house catered to free blacks and sympathetic whites, and people spoke openly about abolition and fugitive slaves and the Underground Railroad. Margaret learned that the Fugitive Slave Act, passed just months earlier, had made escape even more dangerous. She learned that slave catchers now operated freely in northern states, that fugitives weren't safe even in places that had abolished slavery. But she also learned about places further north, Canada, where American laws didn't apply, where fugitive enslaved people could actually be free. She learned about communities of escaped slaves who'd built new lives, about abolitionists who fought to end slavery, about the possibility of a world where people like her could live without fear. On the 3rd day, Margaret returned to Delilah's laundry with $50, 8 of her own carefully hoarded money and 42 earned through backbreaking labor. Delilah counted it carefully, then nodded. "The Helena leaves tomorrow at dawn. You'll go aboard tonight, hidden in a laundry shipment. Stay hidden in the cargo hold until the ship is well away from Charleston. The captain will come find you once it's safe. He'll put you ashore in Philadelphia, where there are people who'll help you get further north. You understand?" "Yes. Once you leave Charleston, you can never come back. You can never write to anyone here, never try to contact people you knew. Any connection back to South Carolina puts you at risk of being caught and returned. You have to become someone new, new name, new history, new life. Can you do that?" Margaret thought about the daughter she'd lost, about the women in the quarters who'd raised her, about her mother Catherine who'd died giving her life. She'd be leaving behind everyone and everything she'd known, becoming a person with no past and uncertain future. But she'd already lost everything that mattered. Her daughter was gone, sold away. Her body had been stolen repeatedly. Her life had never been her own. "Yes," Margaret said firmly. "I can do that." That night, hidden among bundles of clean laundry being loaded onto the Helena, Margaret left Charleston. She was smuggled aboard in darkness, carried into the cargo hold, and left alone among crates and barrels. She waited in the darkness, hardly daring to breathe, while the ship made its final preparations. And when dawn came and she felt the ship begin to move, felt the sway of the vessel leaving the harbor and heading out into open water, Margaret finally allowed herself to cry. She'd done it. She'd escaped. She was sailing away from slavery, away from Edward Beaumont and his violation, away from the plantation that had imprisoned her for 22 years. She didn't know what waited for her in the north. Didn't know if she'd truly be safe even there. Didn't know who she'd become without the identity that had been forced upon her. But she was free. For the first time in her life, she was free. And back in South Carolina, in the small cabin where Margaret had lived, slave catchers finally discovered her hiding place beneath the floorboards. They found the empty space where supplies had been stored. They found the carefully drawn map. They found evidence of years of planning and preparation. They discovered that Margaret hadn't run on impulse or desperation. She'd planned her escape meticulously, gathering resources bit by bit, learning everything she needed to know, waiting for exactly the right moment. The most beautiful slave woman in South Carolina had been far more than her appearance. She'd been intelligent, patient, and brave enough to fight for her freedom in a world designed to crush her. And by the time they discovered the truth, Margaret was already gone, sailing north toward a new life, leaving behind only the secrets hidden in her cabin floor. The Helena was a merchant vessel that regularly traveled between Charleston and Philadelphia, carrying cotton south and manufactured goods north. Captain James Morrison was 58 years old, a weathered sailor who'd been working the coastal trade for 4 decades. He wasn't an abolitionist in any passionate sense. He simply believed slavery was wrong and was willing to take reasonable risks to help people escape it, especially when he was paid for the trouble. On the second day at sea, after the coast of South Carolina had long since disappeared behind them, Morrison descended into the cargo hold where Margaret had been hiding. "You can come out now," he said gruffly. "We're far enough from land that no one's going to turn back even if they found you. You're safe for now." Margaret emerged from behind the crates where she'd been concealed, her body stiff from staying cramped and hidden for so long. Captain Morrison looked at her, still dressed in men's clothing, still maintaining the disguise that had gotten her this far, and shook his head. "Delilah told me about you. Said you're running from the Beaumont plantation, that there's a $500 reward on your head. That true?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand what that means? $500 is enough money that even people who don't like slavery might be tempted to turn you in. You can't trust anyone, not completely. Not until you're far enough north that Southern law can't reach you." "I understand, sir." Morrison studied her more carefully. "You're the one they were calling the most beautiful slave woman in Beaufort County. The one Edward Beaumont kept as his." He stopped, looking uncomfortable. "I see why he'd want you back. But beauty like that can also be a curse when you're trying to hide. Too many people will remember your face." "I know. That's why I'm disguised as a man." "Smart. Keep it up until you're somewhere safe. Maybe even consider keeping it permanently. Plenty of women have lived as men to survive in this world." He gestured toward the deck above. "You can come up for fresh air once a day, but only at night and only when I give you clearance. Stay away from the crew, most of them are decent enough, but some would sell their own mothers for $500. Understand?" "Yes, sir. And thank you for helping me." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "I had a sister once. Beautiful girl, full of life. She married a plantation owner down in Georgia, thought she was getting a fine life. But she wrote me letters over the years, told me things about what happened on that plantation, things that made me sick. She died 10 years ago, broken by what she'd witnessed and couldn't stop. Since then, I've been helping people like you when I can. It's the least I can do." He turned to leave, then paused. "What's your name?" "Your real name, not the one you're using now." "Margaret." "Margaret Sinclair." "Well, Margaret Sinclair, by the time we reach Philadelphia, you'll need to be someone else. Start thinking about who you want to become. The person you were on that plantation, she's dead now. You're being reborn as someone free. That's a powerful thing, but it also means you can't carry the past with you. You understand?" Margaret nodded, though the words hurt. She was already grieving everything she'd left behind, her daughter, the women who'd raised her, even the name her mother had given her. But Captain Morrison was right. Margaret Sinclair, enslaved woman from the Beaumont plantation, couldn't exist anymore. She had to become someone new to truly be free. The voyage to Philadelphia took 6 days. Margaret spent most of the time hidden below deck, emerging only at night for brief periods of fresh air and exercise. She used the time to think about her future, to imagine who she might become. She'd need a new name. She'd need a story about where she came from, something that explained her presence without revealing she was a fugitive. She'd need to find work, a place to live, a way to survive in a world she'd never experienced. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. On the 6th day, Captain Morrison came below deck to tell Margaret they were approaching Philadelphia. "We'll dock at dawn. I'll have you hidden among cargo being unloaded. There's a man on the docks, a free black man named Samuel who works for me regularly. He'll be expecting a special package. That's you. He'll take you to a safe house where people will help you get established." "What do I do then? How do I survive?" "Samuel will explain everything. But Margaret, or whoever you're going to be now, you need to understand something. Even in Philadelphia, you're not completely safe. The Fugitive Slave Act means slave catchers can operate in free states. They can claim any black person is a fugitive and take them south, and the law supports them. You'll need to be careful, always careful." "I understand. I hope you do. I've seen too many people make it north only to get careless and get caught. Stay smart. Stay hidden. And if you ever need to run further, remember, Canada is the only place you'll be truly safe from American law." That night, Margaret barely slept. She was so close to freedom now, but she was also terrified something would go wrong at the last moment. What if authorities were waiting on the docks? What if someone recognized her despite her disguise? What if this was all a trap? But morning came, and the Helena docked in Philadelphia without incident. Margaret was hidden in a barrel among other cargo, feeling like she couldn't breathe in the confined space. She heard men's voices, heard cargo being unloaded, heard the bustle of the busy port. Then someone was rolling her barrel away from the ship, down the dock, and into a warehouse. The barrel was opened, and Margaret found herself looking up at a black man in his 40s with kind eyes and a steady demeanor. "You must be Margaret." "I'm Samuel. Let's get you out of there and somewhere safe." He helped her climb out of the barrel, and Margaret's legs nearly gave out. She'd been cramped in that small space for over an hour. Samuel steadied her, then quickly led her through the warehouse and out a back door where a wagon waited. "Get under the tarp in the back. We're going to my house. It's a safe place, been used by the Underground Railroad for years. Once we're there, we can talk properly about what happens next." Margaret climbed into the wagon and pulled the tarp over herself. She felt the wagon begin to move, heard the sounds of Philadelphia streets, so much busier and louder than Charleston, filled with a chaos of voices and activity that was both exciting and overwhelming. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 20 minutes, the wagon stopped. Samuel pulled back the tarp. "We're here. Come inside, quickly." Samuel's house was modest but comfortable, a small two-story building in a neighborhood of free blacks and working-class whites. His wife, a woman named Grace, greeted Margaret warmly. "Come in, child. You must be exhausted and starving. Let's get you fed and cleaned up, then we can talk about your situation." For the first time in a week, Margaret ate a full meal at a table, washed herself properly, and put on women's clothing again, a simple dress that Grace gave her, worn but clean. It felt strange to be in a dress after days in masculine disguise, but also like stepping back into herself. After Margaret had eaten and rested, Samuel and Grace sat with her in their kitchen to discuss her future. "First things first," Samuel said. "You need a new identity. A new name, a new story." "What were you thinking?" Margaret had been considering this throughout the voyage. "I want to be called Anna. Anna Freeman. The name feels appropriate." Grace smiled. "Anna Freeman. That's a good strong name. And your story? I'll say I was born free in Maryland, that my parents died when I was young, that I came to Philadelphia looking for work and a fresh start. Is that believable? Mostly, Samuel said. But you'll need papers to prove you're free. Without papers, any slave catcher can claim you're a fugitive and try to take you south. That's how the Fugitive Slave Act works. It puts the burden on black people to prove we're free, which is nearly impossible for people who actually are fugitive slaves. How do I get papers? We can create them, Grace said. There are people in the abolitionist community who forge freedom papers. They're not perfect, someone who looks closely might spot them as fraudulent, but they're usually good enough to ward off casual questions. But here's the thing, Samuel added seriously. Even with papers, you're not truly safe. Edward Beaumont clearly values you enough to post a $500 reward. That means he'll hire agents to search for you, might even come north himself to look. You're distinctive, Anna. Your appearance makes you memorable, which makes you easy to track. We need to consider what to do about that. What do you mean? Grace leaned forward. We need to make you less noticeable. Change your appearance somehow. Maybe cut your hair short, dress differently, change how you carry yourself. Anything that makes you look different from the descriptions Beaumont's people will be circulating. Margaret, now Anna, thought about this. She'd spent her entire life being defined by her appearance, having her beauty be both the thing that drew Edward's attention and the thing that made other enslaved people resent her. The idea of deliberately making herself less attractive was both frightening and liberating. I'll do whatever it takes to stay free, she said. Over the next few days, Anna underwent a transformation. Grace cut her long hair short, styled it differently. She showed Anna how to dress in ways that downplayed her figure, how to walk and move differently to seem less graceful and distinctive. Samuel taught her about Philadelphia, which neighborhoods were safe for free blacks, which areas to avoid, how to navigate the complex social rules of a northern city. And they connected her with the abolitionist community, white and black people who were committed to helping fugitive enslaved people and fighting against slavery itself. These people provided Anna with forged freedom papers, with references for employment, and with a network of support she could turn to if she needed help. Anna found work as a seamstress in a small shop owned by a Quaker woman named Rebecca who'd been helping fugitive slaves for years. The work was familiar, she'd learned sewing on the plantation, and the wages, though modest, were more money than Anna had ever possessed honestly in her entire life. She rented a small room in a boarding house run by another free black woman. She attended a church where many free blacks and fugitive slaves worshipped. She began, slowly and carefully, to build a life as Anna Freeman. But she was never completely at ease. Every white face on the street could be a slave catcher. Every knock on her door could be authorities coming to arrest her. Every stranger who looked at her too closely could recognize her from wanted posters that were surely circulating. 3 months after arriving in Philadelphia, Anna's worst fears were nearly realized. She was walking home from work one evening when she noticed a white man following her. He was well-dressed, official-looking, and he kept pace with her even as she tried to walk faster and take turns to lose him. Finally, he called out, "Excuse me, miss. I'd like to speak with you for a moment." Anna's heart raced. This was it. She'd been found. She'd be dragged back to South Carolina, back to Edward, back to slavery and punishment and the destruction of everything she'd fought for. But she forced herself to stop and turn, keeping her face neutral. "Yes, sir." The man approached, studying her face carefully. "I'm looking for a fugitive slave from South Carolina. A woman named Margaret Sinclair. There's a substantial reward for information leading to her capture. Have you heard of her?" "No, sir. I don't know that name." "She's about your age, your height. Light-skinned, very beautiful. The description I have says she's quite distinctive in appearance. He pulled out a piece of paper, a wanted poster with a drawing of Margaret's face. The drawing wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to be recognizable. Anna looked at the poster and forced herself to show only mild interest. "I'm sorry, sir, but I haven't seen anyone matching that description. I'm Anna Freeman, a free woman born in Maryland. If you'd like to verify my status, I have my papers." She pulled out the forged freedom papers Samuel had provided. The man examined them carefully, looking between the papers and Anna's face several times. "These papers say you were born in Baltimore. Can you tell me the name of the church where you were baptized?" Anna's mind raced. Samuel had told her details about Baltimore to include in her story, but had he mentioned a specific church? She couldn't remember. "St. James African Methodist Episcopal Church, sir," she said, hoping it was a real place and that her answer sounded confident. The man studied her for another long, terrible moment. Then he handed back her papers. "My apologies for the interruption, Miss Freeman. If you do happen to hear anything about this Margaret Sinclair, there's a reward for information." "Of course, sir. Good evening." Anna walked away at a normal pace, not allowing herself to run even though every instinct screamed at her to flee. She felt the man's eyes on her back for several steps, then finally heard his footsteps moving in a different direction. She made it back to her boarding house and up to her room before her legs gave out. She'd come so close to being caught. If her forged papers hadn't been convincing, if she hadn't known enough about Baltimore to answer his question, if he'd decided to take her in for questioning regardless of her papers, she'd be on her way back to South Carolina right now. That night, Anna lay awake considering her options. She'd been in Philadelphia for 3 months, and already slave catchers were searching for her. The $500 reward Edward had posted was too tempting for too many people. She'd never be safe in Philadelphia, not really. Which meant she needed to go further north. To New York, or Massachusetts, or even Canada where American law couldn't reach her. The next day, Anna sought out Samuel to discuss her situation. He listened gravely as she described the encounter with the slave catcher. "I was afraid something like this would happen," Samuel said. $500 is too much money. Every bounty hunter and slave catcher in the region will be looking for you. Philadelphia is too close to the south, too easy for them to search. Where should I go? Canada. It's the only place you'll be truly safe. The Fugitive Slave Act doesn't apply there. American authorities can't just grab you and drag you back. There are communities of fugitive slaves in Ontario who've built good lives. You could start fresh there without constantly looking over your shoulder. How would I get there? The Underground Railroad continues north. I can connect you with people who'll help you reach the Canadian border. It'll take several weeks, maybe longer. You'll be passed from safe house to safe house, traveling mostly at night, staying hidden during the day. It's dangerous, but it's possible. Anna thought about this carefully. She'd already risked everything to escape slavery. She'd made it to Philadelphia and had started building a life here. Leaving meant abandoning the progress she'd made, starting over again in a foreign country where she knew no one. But staying meant living in constant fear, always looking over her shoulder, never truly free. "How soon can I leave?" she asked. Samuel smiled approvingly. "I can have you on the road north within a week. But Anna, there's something else you should consider. Once you're in Canada, you might want to think about telling your story. Writing it down, maybe even publishing it. There are abolitionists who collect narratives from fugitive slaves, first-hand accounts of what slavery is really like. These narratives are powerful tools for the abolitionist movement. They put a human face on slavery, make people in the North understand what they're supporting by allowing slavery to continue in the South. Edward would use my story to find me. Maybe. But if your story is public, if people know what he did to you, he might be too ashamed to pursue you. And even if he does, you'll be in Canada where he can't touch you. Your story could help other enslaved people escape. It could change minds about slavery. That's worth something, isn't it? Anna thought about the women she'd left behind in the slave quarters, women who'd raised her, protected her as much as they could, and who were still enslaved. She thought about her daughter, sold away and growing up somewhere in slavery, with no mother to protect her. If her story could help end slavery, if it could contribute even slightly to bringing down the system that had destroyed so many lives, wasn't that worth the risk? "Let me think about it," she said. "First, let me get to Canada. Let me get somewhere truly safe. Then we can talk about what to do with my story." Over the next week, Samuel arranged Anna's passage north. She was given detailed instructions about the route, about which houses to stop at, about how to identify herself to the conductors on the Underground Railroad who would guide her. The night before she left, Grace pulled Anna aside and handed her a small package. "Open it when you're safe in Canada. It's something to remember us by." Anna left Philadelphia on a cold November night, traveling with a group of 3 other fugitive slaves, 2 men and a woman, who were also heading for Canada. Their guide was a white Quaker man named Thomas who'd been conducting people north for over a decade. The journey north was harder than the journey from South Carolina to Philadelphia. They traveled in winter weather, often in snow and freezing temperatures. They walked long distances through forests and along back roads, avoiding main thoroughfares where they might be seen and questioned. They hid in barns, cellars, and secret rooms built specifically for fugitive slaves. Several times, they came close to discovery. Once, they hid in a root cellar while slave catchers searched the farm above them. Another time, they had to cross a river on ice that was starting to thaw, risking drowning if it broke beneath them. But they kept moving north, passed from conductor to conductor, safe house to safe house. And finally, 6 weeks after leaving Philadelphia, they reached the Canadian border. Anna stood on the American side of the Niagara River, looking across to Canada. Freedom, real, permanent, legal freedom, was just across that water. No Fugitive Slave Act. No slave catchers. No Edward Beaumont or anyone else who could claim ownership of her body. They crossed that night, guided by people who knew the safe routes. And when Anna's feet touched Canadian soil, she fell to her knees and wept. She'd done it. She'd escaped slavery completely. She was free, truly, legally, permanently free. The other fugitives in her group celebrated quietly, embracing each other and crying with relief. Thomas, their guide, smiled and patted Anna's shoulder. "Welcome to freedom, Anna Freeman. May you build a wonderful life here." Anna looked up at him through her tears. "Thank you. For everything. For risking yourself to help people like us." "It's my duty and my honor," Thomas said simply. "Now go. Go build that life you've dreamed of. And maybe someday, help others make this same journey." Anna settled in a community of fugitive slaves in St. Catharines, Ontario. She found work as a seamstress again, rented a small house, and began, for the second time, to build a free life. But she couldn't forget Samuel's words about telling her story. And as months passed and Anna felt increasingly secure in her freedom, she began to write. She wrote about her childhood on the Beaumont plantation. She wrote about becoming Edward's forced mistress at 16. She wrote about her pregnancies, her lost children, the daughter sold away. She wrote about planning her escape for 2 years, gathering supplies and information bit by bit. She wrote about the journey north and the people who'd helped her. And she wrote about what she'd hidden in her cabin floor, the supplies, the map, the evidence of long planning that proved enslaved people were intelligent, capable, and deserving of freedom. Her narrative, when published in 1852 under the title, The Hidden Truth, One Woman's Escape from Slavery, became one of the most widely read slave narratives of its time. It was graphic, unflinching, and deeply personal, describing sexual violence, forced pregnancy, and the psychological torture of slavery in ways that made Northern readers understand the true brutality of the institution. Edward Beaumont tried to suppress the book, claiming it was libel and that Margaret had invented stories to slander him. But the details in Anna's narrative were too specific, too verifiable. And other enslaved people from the Beaumont plantation who'd escaped north confirmed that everything Anna had written was true. The narrative contributed to the growing abolitionist movement in the North, helping turn public opinion against slavery. And it gave hope to enslaved people who heard about it, proof that escape was possible, that freedom could be achieved, that the system that enslaved them could be fought and beaten. Anna Freeman lived in Canada for the rest of her life. She married a free black man and had 3 children, children who were born free, who would never know slavery, who grew up with opportunities she'd never had. She never forgot the women who'd raised her on the Beaumont plantation. She never stopped thinking about her lost daughter. And she never stopped working for abolition, speaking at gatherings and writing letters and supporting the Underground Railroad that had saved her life. And when the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished throughout the United States, Anna was 67 years old. She'd spent 22 years enslaved and 45 years free, more of her life in freedom than in bondage. She'd survived. She'd escaped. She'd told her truth. And the secrets hidden in her cabin floor, the evidence of years of planning and preparation, had been revealed to the world, proving that enslaved people were not passive victims but active resistors who fought for their freedom in whatever ways they could. Anna Freeman, who'd been born Margaret Sinclair, died in 1905 at the age of 77. She was buried in Canada, in a cemetery where many fugitive slaves had found their final rest. Her gravestone read simply, Anna Freeman, 1828 to 1905. Born in slavery, died in freedom. The truth will set you free, ****. And her story lived on, a testament to courage, survival, and the indomitable human desire for freedom. The publication of Anna's narrative in 1852 sent shockwaves through both the North and the South. In the North, abolitionists seized upon it as definitive proof of slavery's brutality. In the South, plantation owners raged against what they called abolitionist propaganda and lies designed to incite slave rebellion. Edward Beaumont was particularly devastated by the book's success. Anna's detailed descriptions of his crimes, the rape, the forced pregnancy, the sale of their daughter, were public now. His wife Virginia finally had confirmation of what she'd long suspected, and their already cold marriage became arctic. His social standing in Charleston society crumbled as people whispered behind his back about the revelations in the book. Beaumont tried to fight back legally, filing lawsuits claiming defamation and demanding the book be banned. But his attorneys faced an impossible challenge. They couldn't prove Anna's claims were false without exposing Beaumont to even more scrutiny. And Anna, safely ensconced in Canada, was beyond the reach of American courts. In desperation, Beaumont offered an even larger reward, $1,000, for information leading to Anna's capture and return. But the reward backfired spectacularly. The amount was so large it drew attention to the case, and newspapers in the North ran stories questioning why Beaumont would pay so much for one enslaved woman unless the accusations in her narrative were true. If Edward Beaumont is innocent of the crimes described in Anna Freeman's narrative, wrote one editorial in a Boston newspaper, why does he seek her return so desperately? A truly innocent man would be content to let her live in exile, rather than advertising to the world his burning desire to recapture a woman he claims barely meant anything to him. The narrative also had an unexpected effect on the Beaumont plantation itself. Several enslaved people, inspired by Anna's success, attempted their own escapes. Most were caught and brutally punished, but 2 families did make it north successfully, and they carried with them more stories about conditions on the plantation. Ruth and Patience, the 2 women who'd shared a cabin with Margaret before her escape, were among those who tried to run. Ruth was caught and sold south as punishment, but Patience made it to Philadelphia where she connected with Samuel and Grace. She eventually followed Anna's path to Canada, and when she arrived, she sought out Anna immediately. Their reunion was emotional and bittersweet. Patience brought news from the plantation, news that filled Anna with grief and guilt. "Your mama's daughter is still there," Patience said, referring to Esther, the elderly woman who'd helped raise Margaret. "She's old now, too frail to run. But she wanted you to know she's proud of you. She read your narrative." One of the young house slaves who can read got hold of a copy and read it out loud in the quarters. "Your mama cried when she heard it. Said you'd done what she never had the courage to do." "I wish I could have brought her with me," Anna said, tears streaming down her face. "I wish I could have saved everyone." "You saved yourself," Patience said firmly. "That matters. And your story has helped others escape. At least 6 people I know of ran away after hearing about what you did. You gave people hope, Margaret, Anna. You showed us it was possible." Patience also brought news about Anna's daughter, the child who'd been sold away when she was 4 years old. "I asked around before I left, tried to find out what happened to her. A woman in the next county knew something. She said your girl was sold to a family named Harrison who owned a plantation near Augusta. The little girl was light-skinned and pretty, so they kept her as a house slave, trained her to sew and clean. Her name is Elizabeth now, they renamed her when they bought her." Anna's heart broke all over again. Her daughter was 12 years old enough to start experiencing the same horrors Anna had endured. Would Elizabeth be beautiful like her mother? Would she draw the same dangerous attention? Would she suffer the same violations? "I have to find her," Anna said. "I have to get her out." But Patience shook her head sadly. "Anna, you can't go back south. The reward on your head is too big. You'd be caught before you got within 100 miles of Augusta. And even if you made it, how would you get Elizabeth out? She's probably watched constantly, and she'd have no reason to trust some stranger claiming to be her mother. So I just abandon her. Leave her in slavery while I live free." "You survive," Patience said gently. "You live the life you escaped to have. You honor your mama's sacrifice and your daughter's suffering by making something of your freedom. And maybe, if the war comes that people keep talking about, maybe slavery will end and Elizabeth will be freed that way." Anna knew Patience was right, but the guilt was overwhelming. She'd saved herself but couldn't save her daughter. She'd escaped but left behind everyone she loved. Freedom had come at a price she wasn't sure she could bear. In the years that followed, Anna threw herself into the abolitionist movement, trying to channel her pain into action. She spoke at gatherings, always carefully, never revealing her exact location in case bounty hunters were still searching for her. She helped other fugitive slaves settle in Canada. She worked with the Underground Railroad to improve escape routes and safe houses. And she continued to write. She published a second narrative in 1856, this one focusing specifically on the lives of enslaved women and the sexual violence they endured. It was even more controversial than the first book, with many people, even abolitionists, uncomfortable with such explicit discussion of rape and forced pregnancy. But Anna refused to sanitize her story. "People need to understand what slavery really is," she told Rebecca, the Quaker woman who'd first employed her in Philadelphia and who now corresponded regularly with Anna. "They need to know it's not just about physical labor and whippings. It's about the complete destruction of human dignity, about women having no control over their own bodies, about children being created through violence and then sold away like livestock. If people can't face these truths, they'll never truly oppose slavery." Anna's second narrative sold even better than the first, and it inspired a wave of other enslaved women to come forward with their own stories. The systematic sexual exploitation of enslaved women became a major talking point in abolitionist circles, forcing even moderate anti-slavery advocates to confront the full horror of the institution. In 1857, Anna married a man named James Carter, a free black man who'd been born in Canada to parents who'd escaped slavery decades earlier. James was a skilled carpenter who'd built a successful business in St. Catharines. He'd read Anna's narratives and sought her out, wanting to meet the woman whose courage had inspired so many. Their courtship was careful. Anna had learned not to trust easily, especially not men. But James was patient and genuine, respecting her boundaries and never pressuring her. When he proposed marriage, he told her, "I know what was done to you. I've read your story. And I want you to know that I will never, ever take anything from you that you don't freely give. Your body is yours. Your choices are yours. I want to be your partner, not your owner." Those words, more than anything else, convinced Anna to say yes. They married in a small ceremony attended by friends from the fugitive slave community. And for the first time in her life, Anna experienced intimacy that was consensual, gentle, and based on mutual respect. She'd been violated so many times that she thought she could never enjoy physical affection. But with James, slowly and carefully, she learned that her body could be a source of pleasure rather than pain. Anna became pregnant in 1858, and the pregnancy terrified her. All her previous pregnancies had been the result of rape, and none had ended well. She was afraid this baby would somehow carry the trauma of those earlier experiences, or that she'd die in childbirth like so many enslaved women whose bodies had been destroyed by repeated forced pregnancies. But this pregnancy was different. She had access to good medical care from a sympathetic doctor in the fugitive community. She was well fed and not forced to work until exhaustion. And most importantly, this baby was wanted, conceived in love rather than violence. Anna gave birth to a healthy daughter in March 1859. They named her Catherine, after Anna's mother who died giving birth to her. The baby was beautiful, with Anna's light complexion and James's kind eyes. Holding Catherine for the first time, Anna wept, not from pain this time, but from joy mixed with grief. This was what it was supposed to feel like to have a baby. This was the experience she should have had with her first daughter, the child who'd been stolen from her. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the baby. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save your sister. But I promise you, you'll grow up free. You'll never know slavery. You'll have choices I never had. That's my gift to you." Over the next few years, Anna had 2 more children, a son named Samuel, after the man who'd helped her in Philadelphia, and another daughter named Grace, after one of the twin daughters she'd sent north all those years ago, though only Anna knew the significance of the name. She raised her children in a home filled with love and security, giving them everything she'd been denied. She taught them to read and write. She told them stories about their heritage, about the grandmother and great-grandmother they'd never known, about the brutal system of slavery their parents had escaped. And she never let them forget that their freedom was precious, hard-won, and fragile. The United States still has slavery, she reminded them. Millions of people who look like us are still enslaved. You must never take your freedom for granted, and you must always work to help others gain the freedom you were born into. The Civil War began in April 1861, and Anna watched with a mixture of hope and fear. She hoped the war would end slavery, but she feared what would happen to the enslaved people caught in the middle of the conflict. She feared for her mother Esther, for the women in the quarters who'd raised her, and especially for her daughter Elizabeth who would be 15 now. Throughout the war, Anna continued her abolitionist work. She raised money for contraband camps, settlements where enslaved people who'd fled to Union lines lived in limbo, technically free but without resources or protection. She collected clothing and supplies to send south. She wrote articles and gave speeches encouraging the Union to make ending slavery a war aim, not just preserving the Union. When Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, Anna cried with relief and frustration. Relief that slavery was finally being attacked legally. Frustration that the proclamation only freed enslaved people in Confederate states, not in border states that remained in the Union. "It's not enough," she told James. "It's a start, but it's not enough. We need complete abolition throughout all states, not just the ones in rebellion." The war finally ended in April 1865, and slavery was officially abolished by the 13th Amendment later that year. Anna was 37 years old and had been free for 15 years, more than half her life now. But the joy of abolition was tempered by devastating news from the South. Patients, who'd maintained contact with people still in South Carolina, wrote to Anna with information she'd been dreading. Esther had died in 1863, still enslaved, never experiencing the freedom Anna had fought for. She'd been 84 years old and had spent every day of her life as someone's property. And Elizabeth, Anna's daughter, had died in 1864 during the chaos of Sherman's march through Georgia. The details were unclear, but witnesses said the Harrison plantation had been burned, and several enslaved people had died in the violence that followed. Elizabeth was among them. She'd been 19 years old. Anna fell into a deep depression upon learning her daughter was dead. The guilt was overwhelming. If she'd tried harder to rescue Elizabeth, if she'd been braver, if she'd sacrificed her own freedom to save her daughter, maybe the girl would still be alive. James held Anna while she wept. "You couldn't have saved her," he said gently. "If you'd gone back, you'd both be dead. Or you'd have been recaptured and spent the rest of your life enslaved. What happened to Elizabeth is a tragedy, but it's not your fault. The fault belongs to the system that enslaved her, to Edward Beaumont who created her through violence and then sold her away, to a society that allowed slavery to exist at all." Logically, Anna knew James was right. But emotional logic and knowledge couldn't ease the pain of knowing her daughter had died enslaved, had suffered and died without ever knowing her mother had tried to save her by escaping and fighting against slavery itself. Anna was 40 by the time she truly began to heal from Elizabeth's death. She channeled her grief into helping the newly freed people flooding north after the war. She worked with organizations that provided education, job training, and housing for former slaves who were trying to build free lives. And she began work on a third book, not a narrative this time, but a history of enslaved women's resistance. She interviewed dozens of women who'd escaped slavery, documenting their stories of subtle and overt resistance. She wrote about women who'd poisoned abusive masters, who'd conducted secret schools to teach enslaved children to read, who'd worked with the Underground Railroad, who'd killed their own children rather than see them grow up enslaved. The book was controversial and difficult to publish. Many people, even abolitionists, weren't comfortable with stories of enslaved women using violence or making such extreme choices. But Anna persisted, and the book was finally published in 1871. Enslaved women weren't passive victims, Anna wrote in the introduction. We were active resistors who fought for our dignity and humanity in every way available to us. Some of those ways were quiet and subtle. Others were dramatic and violent. But all of them were acts of resistance against a system designed to break our spirits and deny our humanity. In 1875, 25 years after escaping slavery, Anna made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She decided to return to South Carolina for the first time since her escape. "It's safe now," she told James when he expressed concern. "Slavery is abolished. Edward Beaumont can't reclaim me even if he finds me. And I need to see the plantation one more time. I need to visit my mother's grave and honor the women who helped me survive." James insisted on coming with her, and their 3 children, now teenagers, came too. It was important to Anna that her children see where she'd come from, understand the full reality of what slavery had been. The journey south was strange and bittersweet. The Beaumont plantation had changed dramatically since Anna had left. The big house showed signs of decay and neglect. Apparently the family had fallen on hard times after the war ended and they'd lost their enslaved labor force. Edward Beaumont was still alive, now 70 years old and reportedly in poor health. Anna had no desire to see him, but she heard from former enslaved people who still lived in the area that he'd become a bitter, broken man, obsessed with the glory days of the antebellum South. Anna visited the slave quarters, which now stood empty and crumbling. Her old cabin was still there, though the roof had partially collapsed. She went inside carefully and pulled up the floorboard where she'd hidden her escape supplies 25 years earlier. The hiding place was still there, empty now but bearing silent witness to the years of planning and hope it had held. Anna ran her fingers over the worn wood, remembering the girl she'd been when she'd first discovered this hiding spot, the woman she'd become as she'd filled it with supplies and maps and dreams of freedom. "This is where I kept the things that saved my life," she told her children. "This is where I hid my hope." They visited the plantation cemetery where enslaved people had been buried in unmarked graves. Anna couldn't identify exactly which grave was her mother Catherine's, but she stood among the graves and spoke to all the women who'd suffered and died there. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," she whispered. "I'm sorry I survived when so many didn't. But I promise I've tried to honor your memories. I've told your stories. I've fought to make sure others didn't suffer as you did. And I've raised my children to remember you and what you endured." Before leaving South Carolina, Anna did something unexpected. She arranged to meet with Virginia Beaumont, Edward's widow. Edward had died just months earlier, and Virginia was now living alone in the big house with only a few servants. Their meeting was tense and awkward. Virginia was 73 years old, bitter and lonely, and she greeted Anna with obvious hostility. "You ruined my life," Virginia said bluntly. "Your book, your accusations, they destroyed my husband's reputation and our family's standing." "Your husband ruined your life," Anna replied, just as bluntly. "What he did to me, what he did to many enslaved women, those were his choices. I simply told the truth about them. He claimed you seduced him. I was 16 years old and he was 30. He had all the power and I had none. There is no such thing as seduction under those circumstances. There is only rape." Virginia looked away, and Anna could see the older woman struggling with truths she'd spent decades denying. Finally, Virginia spoke again, her voice quieter. "I knew. I always knew what he was doing. But I told myself it wasn't my concern, that enslaved women existed for such purposes, that men simply had different needs." She laughed bitterly. "What a fool I was. What a coward." "Yes," Anna said simply. "You were both." They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Virginia stood and left the room, returning with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Before Edward died, he had a moment of clarity, or maybe it was guilt-driven delirium. "He told me about a daughter. A light-skinned girl child he'd fathered on you and then sold away. He kept records of the sale, thinking he might someday try to reclaim her if she turned out valuable. Her name was Elizabeth. She was sold to the Harrison family." Anna's hands shook as she took the bundle. "I know. She died during the war." "I didn't know that," Virginia said quietly. I'm sorry. No child should die that way." The bundle contained papers, the bill of sale for Elizabeth, along with a letter Edward had written but never sent, addressed to the Harrison family inquiring about the girl's health and development. "Why are you giving me these?" Anna asked. "Because they're yours. They're proof of your daughter's existence, proof of what my husband did. I don't know what good they'll do you now, but they're not mine to keep." Virginia paused. "I don't expect forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I do understand, finally, what you and all the other women endured. And I'm sorry. That means nothing, changes nothing, but I am sorry." Anna looked at this bitter old woman who'd benefited from slavery her entire life, who'd turned a blind eye to the suffering happening all around her, and she felt pity mixed with anger. "I don't forgive you," Anna said honestly. "But I accept that you finally acknowledged the truth. That's more than many white women ever do." Anna returned to Canada with her family, carrying Elizabeth's papers and a heart full of complicated emotions. The trip had given her closure on some things while opening wounds she thought had healed. But it had also reminded her why her work mattered. Slavery was abolished, but its effects would linger for generations. The children born to enslaved mothers, the families torn apart, the bodies and spirits broken by years of bondage, none of that would be fixed simply by changing laws. The fight for true freedom and equality would continue long after slavery itself ended. Anna lived another 30 years, watching her children grow into adults and have children of their own. She saw the rise of Jim Crow laws in the South, the continued oppression of Black Americans despite legal freedom, and the long, difficult struggle for civil rights. She died in 1905 at age 77, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, a family that existed because she'd been brave enough to risk everything for freedom. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, former fugitive slaves she'd helped, abolitionists she'd worked with, and descendants of women whose stories she'd preserved in her books. And at her funeral, her eldest daughter Catherine read from Anna's first narrative, sharing the story of the hiding place beneath the cabin floorboard, the supplies gathered bit by bit, the maps drawn in secret, the years of planning that led to freedom. "My mother taught me that freedom is never given," Catherine said. "It must be claimed. She taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite fear. She taught me that our stories matter, that truth matters, and that justice matters even when it's difficult and painful to pursue." Anna Freeman was buried in Canada, far from the plantation where she'd been born, far from the cabin where she'd hidden her hopes and dreams. Her gravestone bore the simple inscription she'd requested. Anna Freeman. Born Margaret Sinclair. 1828 to 1905. She chose freedom ***. And beneath that, words Anna had written herself shortly before her death. "What they discovered inside my cabin was not just supplies for escape, but evidence that enslaved people never stopped being human, never stopped planning, never stopped hoping. We hid our dreams in floorboards and our resistance in silence. But we were always free in our minds, even when our bodies were enslaved. And eventually, we claimed in reality the freedom we'd always held in spirit." The story of what was discovered in the cabin of South Carolina's most beautiful slave woman became more than just a tale of escape. It became a symbol of resistance, of the humanity that could not be destroyed by slavery, of the courage required to claim freedom in a world designed to deny it. And it remained a reminder, for generations to come, that freedom is worth any price, any sacrifice, any risk, because without freedom, life itself is hollow. Author's note: this story is fictional but based on the very real experiences of countless enslaved women who endured sexual violence, forced pregnancy, and the loss of their children during American slavery. Their courage in resisting, surviving, and eventually escaping that brutal system deserves to be honored and remembered. While the characters are invented, the historical context and the kinds of choices they faced were tragically real for millions of enslaved people in America.